Hi, everybody. This is Penina Taylor, and I want to start by telling you that this is a re-recording of a class that was given 2 days ago. It is the Navigating Judaism course. We are on the 4th module today, which is going to be about the Jewish home. We have talked about Shabbat. We did 3 weeks on the Jewish holidays, and we did Jewish prayer, and now we are talking about the Jewish home. Please understand that it's going to be a shortened version because we won't have the interaction that we had during the live class, but we ran into a glitch and it didn't record, and so I'm re-recording this for the purpose of my students. I'm doing this video so that my students will be able to have a recording of what we talked about this week. All right. As I mentioned in the class on prayer, the Jewish home and homes, in other words, the entire community, is the center of Jewish life. Okay? Life cycle events combined with the yearly holiday calendar create a framework around which the Jewish life revolves. But how is the Jewish home created? Well, today's class is going to be a little different from the others that we've done so far because up until now, we have leaned very heavily on scripture. It was a very heavily scripture-heavy course. And today we're going to be leaning a little bit more in the direction of cultural topics that will hopefully give you some insight into the Jewish home and the Jewish community. All right, so we're going to start actually with dating. See, in traditional Judaism, there is no such thing as casual dating. The only reason for a young man and a young woman to interact is for the purpose of looking for a life partner. Within Orthodox Judaism, there is almost no interaction between men and women or boys and girls who are not related with each other until they reach an age where they are ready to start looking for their life partner. So from very early on, girls and boys are separated. In Israel, in the more religious communities, boys and girls are even separated in nursery school. Okay, and for sure by elementary school. Now in America, you have communities that don't have so many, like sometimes you have very small Jewish communities and they may not be able to separate kids in the lower grades, but pretty much across the board in Orthodox schools, you do have more modern Orthodox schools where you have boys and girls together, but for the most part, they are separated in high school. So as I mentioned, in Israel, in the more religious communities, the children will be separated from nursery school. In other communities, it starts at first grade, and certainly by mid-elementary school, boys and girls are separated in all but the non-religious school systems. And like I said, in America, it all depends on the size of the community and if there are enough students to be able to make a separation at a young age. Also, the more modern you get, because remember I explained that Judaism and even Orthodox Judaism is on a spectrum. So the more modern you get, the more likely you are to have high school kids not separated. But for most of the Orthodox world, they will be separated. Now, before I go any further, I need to explain that Orthodox Judaism is not a monolithic entity, that it's homogeneous, right? It's not. I can't simply take a picture for you and then you'll know what Orthodox Judaism looks like. It rides a spectrum. You find great variations from community to community and everything in between. The bad news is, this means that you can't simply ask for a set of rules and then live by them. But the good news is that even within what we call orthodoxy, there is such a spectrum on so many things that there is a little bit of wiggle room for you to find what you are comfortable with and to find a community that best matches your comfort level in the different areas. All right, so don't get too overwhelmed. And remember, write down any questions that you have. And the invitation at this point in the original, I was inviting people to unmute themselves. You, on the other hand, watching the recording, I'm going to invite you to comment on the Facebook group. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. But this is a much more flowy style class. So like I said, from early on in the life of a young person, there is a clear separation of genders. Now, the more you slide down the spectrum towards what's called modern Orthodox, the less this is the case. And there are, as I said, modern Orthodox high schools that are mixed gender, but and they are still considered Orthodox. Still, in general, the separation is made. And among the most religious, adults will even refer to other adults of the opposite gender by their last name, so as not to become too casual or familiar with someone who is not their own spouse. Although this is not usually the case among the more modern Orthodox. However, even among the modern Orthodox, people are careful not to touch a person of the opposite gender. There's no handshaking and certainly no hugging anyone you're not related to of the opposite gender. At Shabbat tables and public concerts and classes, people are usually seated separately. Again, I'll probably say this a dozen more times over the course of the next hour, but keep in mind that this varies greatly along that spectrum of orthodoxy. The ultra-Orthodox might even have separate tables for men and women at the Shabbat meal. Whereas in my family, we do try to sit women and men who are not married to each other, next to a person of the same gender, unless they are married, in which case then they might sit next to their spouse. But in some modern Orthodox homes, no attention is paid at all to where somebody is seated at the table. So again, it really does vary quite a lot, but the majority of Orthodox separate men and women who are not married from each other to a varying degree of separation. But as I was explaining tonight to somebody, the first handful of weddings that I went to, the first few Orthodox Jewish weddings that I went to after I first became religious, every single one of them had separate seating for the meal at the wedding. Men on one side of the room, women on the other. And so I actually felt a little awkward because I was separated from my husband and I didn't know anybody. But that's the way it is done for the most part in that community. Whereas in Israel, a lot of anybody who's not in the ultra-Orthodox camp probably has what they call family style seating. Even though the dancing is separated, the meal itself won't be separated. The people will be able to sit next to their spouses for dinner. Okay? The term used to explain that one is committed to not touching a member of the opposite gender is called being shomer negia. The word shomer means to guard, and negia means touch. So it means that one is careful not to touch others of the opposite gender. All right. A lot of times when a young man and a young woman meet each other, especially if they're more modern Orthodox, you might have one say to the other, I'm shomer negia, meaning I don't touch. And this was something that happened with my daughter and her husband, that when they first met, she was committed to being shomer negia. He was not. And she told him that she was shomer negia, and he chose to be shomer negia in order to date my daughter. So that's where that word kind of comes into, that phrase comes into play. This practice is not because Judaism believes that one gender or the other is inferior or superior, but rather because the sages were keenly aware of the effect that touch can and should have on people. And if you think about it, if you had never been touched by a member of the opposite sex, being intimate after marriage is a very different experience. It's completely charged and it's very special. So when a young man or a young woman nears the age of being old enough to think about marriage, they begin the process of looking for a spouse. Now, depending on one's community, like I said, you're going to hear this a lot over the course of this class, this may involve going to a matchmaker. In Hebrew, the word is a shadchan, and a shadchan makes a shidduch, which means a match, right? And the term is used in marriage. It's also used in business. Whenever you make a match between people, you're making a shidduch, okay? So they begin the process of looking for a spouse. Now, depending on the community, in some cases, the shadchan or matchmaker is simply a mutual friend. And nowadays, there are even websites that are specifically designed for Torah observant Jews to find potential mates. So how did my 4 children find their spouses? My first child to get married was my daughter, Rachel. Okay. And when we first came to Israel, we moved into a community, and every Shabbat morning I would have coffee with one of my neighbors, and we would talk about life and talk about things that were going on. And she happened to mention one time that she has a son who's in the army, and he's going to be getting out in about a year. And I mentioned to her that I had a daughter who was just finishing up high school, and she was going to be coming to Israel to go to seminary during the next year. And a seminary is a post-high school religious program for Orthodox Jewish girls. When they graduate high school, they'll often spend 1 year in one of these religious schools. It's the female equivalent of a yeshiva, so that they can study and get their religious foundation shored up before they go into college or marriage or whatever. So anyway, so she was telling me that she had a son who was getting out of the army. And I was telling her that I had a daughter who was graduating high school. And we talked about, hey, maybe it would be an idea we should introduce them to each other. So we did. When Rachel came over to Israel finally, and we introduced the 2 of them together, I think they went on one date, and they decided that they were not suitable for each other. Very funny story. It turns out that the young man was the same height as my daughter, and we were having this conversation about why they weren't a good match. And she says to me, well, he's short. And I said, well, there are more important things than height, right? Height's not that important. Anyway, sometime later, so they decided that they were not suitable for each other. They decided they were not going to date each other. So, okay, fine. A little while later, a few weeks, my daughter has a few friends over for Shabbat, and I hear her talking. And she's mentioning to her friend, well, height isn't everything. There's more important things than height. And I'm like, I wonder what's happening. What happened was they had decided that they weren't suitable for each other. And then sometime later, they decided to revisit and see if, give it a second chance. And it turned out to be good. And they ended up getting married. Now, they like to say that they were not set up by their mothers. I think it's more of a pride thing. I'm not quite sure. But basically, his mother and I were the matchmakers in that wedding. All right, so that was my first child. My second child to get married was actually my oldest son, Daniel. He was engaged to a young lady before the young woman that he ended up marrying. The first girl, they were introduced by a mutual friend. The second girl, they were also introduced by a mutual friend, but over Facebook. And it turned out that even though she was several years younger than him, they were in the same youth group and social circles. So they started the dating process simply by seeing each other at these mixed youth events. This was a more modern community. And after a while, they realized that they really liked each other, and they decided to become engaged. My third child to get married was my youngest son. He was in yeshiva. And the young lady, as it turned out, I had met her a couple of years before when I had spoken at her high school. Now she was involved in a seminar that I was teaching, and it happened to be that I had space for people to come stay by us for Shabbat. And so I asked if any of the ladies in the seminar would be interested in coming for Shabbat. And of course, the young lady was like, oh, me. So I said, no problem. So she came for Shabbat. She had a great time. Next, a few weeks later, I get a call from the young lady asking if she and her roommate could come to us for Shabbat. Now, you have to understand, my son was in yeshiva. She did not meet my son. She met my other son, but she didn't meet this son. So it turns out that this particular Shabbat that she had asked if she could come to stay, my son ended up being home for Shabbat. So he was there, and he was seated on one side of the table, and she was seated on the other side of the table. And from my end, I could see the sparks flying across the table. Well, after Shabbat was over, he walked the young ladies up to the bus stop, and he managed to make sure that the young lady had his phone number before she left. I'm not sure if he took hers or not, but anyway, that, as they say, was that, and the rest is history. And they ended up dating for a while throughout her seminary year. She went home. For the summer, she told her parents about how she had met this young man and how she wanted to change her entire life plan, which had been to come home and go to college the next year. And instead, she decided to make Aliyah and move to Israel. That summer, he traveled to America to visit her family, to meet her parents, and then they got married that winter. So that's the story of my third child. My last child to get married is actually my third born son. He was at a synagogue event, what we call a kiddush, which is a meal after services, and a friend of theirs, ours, from shul, from synagogue, came up to him and asked if the empty seat next to him was reserved for his kala. Kala is the word for a fiancé or a bride. And so his response was, "I wish." And so the mutual friend said, I may have a young lady for you. He knew of a family with a young woman who was that age and interested in possibly finding a life partner. And so he made the shidduch, he made the match, and they dated for a while, and then they decided to get married. And by the way, their engagement was only 8 weeks long. It's very, very common among Orthodox, especially the more religious Orthodox, that the engagement period is very short, so as not to torture the young couple longer than necessary. Because you got to remember, in the secular world, where you're able to touch and kiss and whatever, depending on your standard, this young man and woman, they just got engaged and decided they want to spend the rest of their life with each other, but they still can't touch each other, right? So the engagement period is kept as short as possible. So you see, in my community, which is somewhere between, in the middle between what we would call ultra-Orthodox and modern Orthodox, there are a variety of ways in which my children met their spouses. But dating, as we use the word in the secular world, is not what we refer to dating in the Jewish world. It's very different. In the secular world, you can date somebody who has no potential to be a spouse. It's a way to engage with the opposite sex and get a certain amount of physical or emotional satisfaction. In the secular world, dating is an end in and of itself, right? Or at least it can be. Whereas in observant Judaism, there is no such thing. In observant Judaism, dating is only done to find out if somebody is an appropriate possible future mate. If one is not ready or interested in getting married, one does not date. It is not for the purpose of having fun. It's not for the purpose of getting something physical. The only reason for dating is to find out if someone is a potential mate. In ultra-Orthodox circles, dating can be anything from a one-time, 1-hour meeting in the parents' living room to several dates, but usually not more than 10. By that time, someone should have a pretty good idea if they want to spend the rest of their lives with this person, right? Does it always work? Well, no, not always. Just as couples who date for years, being married to someone is a whole nother ball of wax, and you still sometimes don't know what you've gotten yourself into. But it works well more often than you might think. In fact, in some communities, there are even still arranged marriages, even though that's becoming more and more rare. But would it surprise you to know that arranged marriages and marriages with very short dating cycles actually end in fewer divorces? Yep, it's true. And it's not just because of the stigma. It's because of expectations. See, when you go into marriage knowing that you don't know the other person, you go in understanding that love is a choice. You are choosing to love this stranger, and the two of you grow together. You know it's going to take work. It has to take work, and you expect it to take work. Unlike the bill of goods that Hollywood has sold to the rest of us, we grew up with this fantasy about how love feels. It's a fairy tale. It's magical. But no one ever talks about the fact that it takes work. Recently, we had a young couple who we had become close to, who decided while they were in our home one Shabbat that they wanted a divorce. Now, they've been married about 2 years. Why did they want a divorce? The answer both of them gave was that love isn't supposed to be so much work. We tried to explain to them that that is exactly what love and marriage are, work. And yep, They ended up divorced. But historically, the divorce rate among Orthodox Jews is much lower than the rest of the world. And it's not, like I said, just because of stigma attached to it. It's because the whole system is designed to create a sanctity around marriage and the understanding that love is something you choose and not something that happens to you. Now, the farther down the spectrum you go towards modern Orthodoxy, the higher the divorce rate. And I attribute that to the fact that they are more exposed to secular ideals and expectations. Now, once a couple has decided to get married, like I said, the engagement period is really quite short. In Israel, it's often only 6 weeks from engagement to the wedding. And like I said, my last couple took 8 weeks. Okay, now, before we start talking about the mikvah and the laws of family purity, I want to share a little bit about birth control with you. Now, in Orthodox Judaism, it is understood that part of the reason that God created man and woman was that they would come together and they would produce children, they would procreate. And while it's certainly not forbidden to stay married and not have children, that really is very much the focus of marriage. And so, and again, this also varies widely where you're falling on the spectrum, but, the ultra-Orthodox basically do not give permission for birth control unless there are extenuating circumstances. And the more modern you go, the less extenuating the circumstances have to be in order to get permission to have to use birth control. But there are a lot of rules about what birth control is allowed and what birth control is not allowed, in addition to why it is or isn't, But if you have a young couple, especially in Israel, when the couples are getting married quite young sometimes, oftentimes they'll be given permission to use birth control for the first few years so that they can graduate college, get out of the army, whatever is going on in their life before they start producing children. Now, there's a story from Bereshit, Genesis chapter 38, verses 6 through 10. It says, "Now Judah took a wife for his son, his firstborn, okay? And her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of Hashem, and so Hashem took his life. So Judah said to Onan, who was the next child in line, 'Go in to your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother.' Now Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and so he took his life also." All right, so this passage is the foundation of our understanding of what birth controls are acceptable and what aren't. So to begin with, you should understand that the idea of spilling or wasting seed or semen is totally not okay in the eyes of Judaism. Therefore, a condom is pretty much never allowed. Now, again, I say pretty much, there are exceptions to the rules. For example, if there is no other birth control method that can be used, then you can sometimes get an exception to be able to use a condom. But condom and pulling out are both forms of birth control that are forbidden according to Jewish law. Now, let's talk about permanent sterilization. All right, it says in Vayikra, which is Leviticus chapter 22, verse 24, "You shall not offer to Hashem anything that has its testicles bruised, crushed, torn, or cut. Neither shall you do this in your land." The sages understood this verse to prohibit sterilization of all male creatures, not just humans, but animals as well. And that can be found in the Talmud, Shabbat 110b. Castration, medieval commentators understood, defies the divine blessing to be fruitful and multiply, and it ultimately destroys his creation. So what is a person to do who does not want more children or cannot carry more children? First of all, you have to understand that according to Jewish understanding, the commandment to be fruitful and multiply applies actually only to the man. You would think it would apply to both, right? but it doesn't. It only applies to man. Why? Because childbirth has historically been, and still is to this day, a danger to the life of the mother. Okay? And it says in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 18, verse 5, so you shall keep my statutes and my judgments, and you shall live by them if you do them. I am the Lord. So the rabbis have taught, you shall live by them and not die by them, meaning that when a life is in danger, almost all the rules can be thrown out the window. So since it's a danger for a woman to give birth, and we had this situation just recently. My daughter-in-law gave birth, and shortly after she hemorrhaged, and she had to be rushed to the hospital, and they had to deal with the situation. She could have, God forbid, died. I have a friend named Rivka Malka Perlman. Maybe some of you know her. She has her story on YouTube, and she also almost died after having her last child. So a woman, because the commandment to produce children, to be fruitful and multiply, does not apply to a woman. If she is in a situation where she cannot have children for whatever reason, she may have surgery to permanently prevent her from having children. But a vasectomy on the man is not permissible. Okay, now, like I said, there are only two forms of birth control that are absolutely forbidden, other than male surgery: the condom and spilling seed or pulling out. However, in most cases, you actually have to have a reason given to use any birth control. I mean, like I said, depending on where you're talking about on the spectrum, the reason may or may not need to be nearly as difficult. But today, the use of birth control is much more universally accepted, except among some of the most ultra-Orthodox Jews. All right. Now, we're going to talk just a little bit, about the laws of family purity, but you have to understand that this in and of itself is a 6 to 12 hour class. All right. So I'm only going to lightly gloss over just some of the basics. Okay. Now, the term used to refer to a woman during her period and for a short time afterwards, during which she is not permitted to her husband, is called nidah. This is translated usually as unclean, but it doesn't mean dirty. It means ritually disqualified from doing certain things. All right, so while a woman is menstruating and for a week after, she is unavailable to her husband, and she is referred to as being nidah. All right, we find the basis for this in the Torah. It says in Leviticus, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 19, also, you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness during her menstrual impurity. And then it says earlier in 15, verse 19, when a woman has a discharge, if her discharge in her body is blood, she shall continue in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. All right. So originally, the biblical commandment was that a woman who has her period is unclean or nidah for 7 days. However, if she bleeds for more than 7 days, she has to do something additional. It says in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 15, verses 25 through 28, now, if a woman has a discharge of her blood many days, not at the period of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond that period, all the days of her impure discharge she shall continue as though in her menstrual impurity. She is, it's translated unclean, but it means unavailable, right? Ritually impure. Any bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her like her bed at menstruation. Everything on which she sits shall be unclean. Likewise, whoever touches them. All right, and this is talking about back during the time of the temple. Some of the rules are a little bit different now. But when she becomes clean from her discharge, she shall then count off for herself 7 days, and afterwards she will be clean or available. All right, so according to the text, the strict understanding of the text, if a woman has her period, she's unclean for 7 days. No matter how many days she bleeds, up until 7. If she bleeds more than 7, so then at the end of that, she would then be able to immerse herself in the ritual waters, which we call the mikvah. It's a very special pool that has very special rules about having to be from living water, and there's a few other things involved in how they can construct such a thing, but she was to immerse herself and then she would be clean. That is if she bled up to 7 days. If she bled more than 7 days, then she had to wait until she stopped bleeding and then add 7 clean days, 7 days that she's not bleeding, to the end of her count. So if she bled 8 days, she has to wait 15 total before she can immerse in the mikvah. So we see that the Torah tells us that when a woman menstruates, she is, as I said, unclean or nidah for 7 days, right? Okay, so over time, it became the custom enacted and accepted by the women of Israel to count 7 clean days after the period, no matter how long she bled. So not just if she bled more than 7 days, but even if she bleeds 3 or 4, she counts those 3 or 4, and then she adds 7, except that they made a minimum of 5. So basically, a woman is unavailable to her husband for a minimum of 12 days. Unless she bleeds longer, in which case it's however long she bleeds plus 7 clean days. Then she ritually immerses in the pool, which is called the mikvah, and then she is available to her husband. Now, there's been a lot of scientific research on Orthodox Jewish women and Orthodox marriages, and the overwhelming conclusion is that this is the healthiest approach, both physically because of the open wound and emotionally because a time of separation makes the time together much more special. In fact, according to Jewish understanding, the time when a man and woman may not touch each other, which is at least 12 days and maybe much longer, is the time of the month when they should be concentrating on the other aspects of what makes a marriage. Because a marriage is not just physical, right? It's also being able to talk to each other and communicate with each other. And so there's a tremendous amount of focus and emphasis on this idea of communicating and learning to speak to each other during those 7 days, during those 12 days when she is unavailable to him, okay? Now, when a woman is pregnant, as long as she doesn't have any bleeding, she does not become nidah until she gives birth, all right? Now, also you need to understand that out of modesty, many Orthodox Jews follow the custom of keeping their times of nidah secret from the general public. I know many families where the woman even her children are totally, completely unaware of the separation. And in many Jewish homes, there is what we had when we lived in America and had a large bedroom is we had a queen size bed and we had a twin size bed. And when I was available, we shared the queen size bed. And when I was unavailable, my husband moved over to the twin size bed. But the beds never changed. And so my children were not aware of any difference in time as far as when I was available, when I wasn't available. Now in Israel, the bedrooms are much, much smaller, and there's no way that we have enough room for a queen size bed and a twin size bed. So we have a very special type of bed that is 2 twin size beds that are on a special foundation that moves together. They're on wheels and they move together, and then you lift up the mattresses and a clamp goes down on the frame that holds the beds together, and the mattresses are sitting in the frame in such a way that they actually come together and they touch each other when they're together. And what that means is that when the beds are clamped together, they don't move, they don't separate, they don't slide. And so it's like having a queen size bed. In fact, we don't even notice that there's a crease between the 2 mattresses. We just put a queen size sheet over the 2 and voila. It's like that for 2 weeks, and then we, separate them when we need to be separate. But the downside of having that type of bed means that people can see when they peer into our bedroom if the beds are separate or together. They know whether or not I'm nidah, which can be a little bit embarrassing. So that's another aspect of modesty that we'll be talking about more when we talk about modesty. But it's very common not to go into somebody else's bedroom, so that you never see the situation and you don't know whether they're nida or not. Okay. Now, a woman who has just given birth, all right, is not allowed to immerse until at least 14 days have passed if she's given birth to a girl. But it's not an issue. I think it's 7 days for a boy, 14 for a girl, but it's not an issue anyway, because postpartum bleeding very rarely ends soon enough for it even to be possible. After giving birth, most women bleed for several weeks. When the bleeding stops, she can do a check, she can count her 7 clean days, and then she can immerse in the mikvah. All right, the procedure is exactly the same as after a menstrual period, but it doesn't always go so smoothly, all right? Because the median duration of postpartum bleeding is about 28 days, and it can stop and it can start again. So like a lot of times a woman will get a clean day and then she'll go to the mikveh, and then a day later she starts bleeding again or something like that. So it can be a difficult time for her, and it's definitely a time for her to focus on herself and her new baby and her relationship with her husband outside of the physical aspect of it. Now, because of the way the timing works, that a woman is available to her husband approximately 12 to 14 days after she had her period, it actually makes her in her most fertile time. And so since the laws kind of work in the way that it promotes conception, that's why they had to make a way for a woman to be allowed to use contraception, because it's not always the best thing for somebody to get pregnant right away, or it may not be a time in their life when, it would just produce way more stress than they are able to handle. And so the most common birth control that's used in Judaism is the pill. And I believe that IUDs and diaphragms are also used. And like I said, if somebody is not able to do any of those, then they have to talk with the rabbi, and sometimes they can get an exception. Now, even though the video that I'm doing right now is, I think we're only a little bit over a half an hour, the original took much longer to get to this point. So since this is where we stopped, I'm going to stop the video, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Please remember to go ahead and post in the Facebook group if you have any questions, or if you want to discuss anything that came up for you, or if you have any insights, I'd love to hear them. Thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to seeing you next week. We're going to finish the rest of this, and I believe we're going to be talking about modesty next. Take care.